different places around. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers, and we have Sydney Haney and Celia White with the Stroubles Creek Coalition, and they're going to talk about saving Stroubles Creek. All right, well, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to be here and get to talk about all the fun work we do and hopefully get you excited about the riparian buffers and watersheds of Blacksburg. Our presentation is on reforesting the watershed for the health and the people of the planet. And we're here with Stroubles Creek Coalition, also known as Ecological Restoration Collaborative. You can speak a little louder. Yeah, project, okay. Okay. And I'm a wildlife biologist and cleanup coordinator. I'm wildlife biology through watershed restoration solutions and cleanup coordination through the New River Conservancy. Did you get into it? I got into it because I was studying wildlife conservation at Virginia Tech, and I became familiar with the Stroubles Creek Coalition project, and it was a great way to work at the intersection of restoration, ecology, and wildlife conservation.
And yeah, I'm Celia White. I'm a restoration ecologist with Watershed Restoration Solutions and also a cleanup coordinator with the New River Conservancy. I have a background not in this in academics, but I ended up doing wildland fire and then got into a variety of similar projects before ending up here. And we'll explain a little more about these different entities and who they are and how they work together later on. Oh, also, there is the common misconception that we are volunteers. We are not. We are full-time employees. So that's a question that we get very frequently, and we'll explain a little more about our volunteer involvement. But so in terms of what we're talking about today, we get a lot of questions out in the field about what we're doing when people see us out working in sheep pastures or planting trees or wandering around with a lot of tools in our hands. And so we wanted to explain the background of this restoration project, but also go a little bit deeper into why we choose the restoration methods that we do and why they are important. We'll talk briefly about the Stroubles Creek watershed, its history, the land use around here, how it came to be considered impaired, and then the restoration efforts focusing on three main projects that have been part of the restoration since the early 2000s. And then we'll talk about community involvement and our next steps.
Here is our most up-to-date map of the Stroubles Creek watershed. We're in it right now. It covers about 22 square miles, starting at the 16 springs in Blacksburg. If you've ever seen those little frogs by show of hands, the little metal frogs around Blacksburg, they each symbolize one of the springs that serves as the headwaters. It goes underground before popping back up to the duck pond. So it's under the center of Virginia Tech's drill field. It's got a flow rate of about 200 cubic feet per second in different places. It varies, but that's a very small percent of the Mississippi River's volume at the New Orleans area, but about 3% of the volume of the New River as it passes through Glenlyn, which is just on the other side of Giles County. So it's a considerable part of the volume of our larger watershed. Here's a map that focuses on our restoration efforts and the locations. There are 3 or 4 main branches, including Holton Branch, which is, you probably haven't heard of that. It comes up near the Copenhagen Sheep Center for Virginia Tech and goes through a lot of the agricultural lands. We've got the main stem of Stroubles Creek that comes from the duck pond downwards. Docks Branch, which is if you are driving down 460 and you see like 70 plus deer standing out in the field off to the east side, that's Docks Branch. And we've got Smithfield Branch, which, as its name implies, it pops up right near Smithfield and promptly thereafter dumps into the main stem of Stroubles. So the red areas here symbolize where we have focused our riparian replanting efforts.
All right, so is anyone in here familiar with the general history of this watershed and the land use here? Okay, good. So before the 1700s and the arrival of Europeans, this was and still is the land of the Monacan and Tutelo people. They used this area long before anyone else ever showed up. It was a wonderful place to settle because of the 16 springs, a lot of freshwater access here. And then in the 1740s, colonists arrived and began a period of heavy, intensive agriculture. And that included the Smithfield plantation, a lot of livestock fields, a lot of farming, which we still have to this day. They clear cut a lot of the forests, especially around the creek. And in the early days, especially, they drained all of the sewage from the town into the creek, which, as you can imagine, is not the best place for sewage. And there were consequences pretty quickly. So after that was figured out, there was a little bit more focus on making sure the creek was clean. However, in the 1920s to 40s, Virginia Tech had a lot of infrastructure development that included the construction of the drill field, during which they buried Stroubles Creek. So there's a large portion of the creek that is buried beneath Virginia Tech's campus. And they also dammed up a portion of it to create the duck pond, into which the chemistry department dumped a lot of chemicals in the 70s and 80s. It has since been dredged. We are not entirely certain how effective that was, but it has been addressed at several points. And in the 1990s, Virginia introduced a law that all livestock on state lands have to be fenced out of creeks for water quality purposes. So that did occur. And you can still see some of the old fencing in areas where there are no longer livestock fields. But in 2002, which Sydney will talk about in a moment, the restoration needs for this watershed were identified and restoration began.
So we'll go back in time for a second to the establishment of the Clean Water Act, because that's kind of how we got to where we are today with the Stroubles Creek restoration initiatives. In 1972, the federal government decided that we needed some more structure around clean water and protecting the waters of the United States. This was heavily inspired by the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire, which was one of a dozen fires on the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland. Until 1969, the river had been seen as a center of industry, not as a living, breathing ecosystem full of living things. So after this received nationwide and worldwide publication, the Clean Water Act followed promptly thereafter. And the Clean Water Act established pollution control standards, such as the total maximum daily load, which is essentially the maximum allowable amount of pollution that can be put into water, allowing it to maintain certain water quality standards. So there was an impairment designation platform that was created through this, the 303D list, where states would submit impaired bodies of water that they identified to be recognized federally and receive funding and structure to be cleaned up thereafter. So you can see the picture of the Cuyahoga River fire and an initiative from VT Site and Infrastructure Development that was talking a little bit about getting Stroubles Creek off of that list and some steps that we would take. Another reason that Stroubles Creek was identified as impaired was the impaired benthic communities. So mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, also known as Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera. Those are the orders that they fall under. EPT, they comprise the most sensitive of aquatic insects. So if there's a large pollution event, they may be the first to disappear. So we use this thing called the EPT index, Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, Trichoptera index, and compare how many of those we're finding with all of the other macroinvertebrates, like maybe crayfish, snails, crane flies, black fly midges, the little biting fellows. And the main reason that these were impaired were sedimentation from eroding stream banks as a result of heavy agriculture. So in case it's unclear, the sediment comes into the water and it takes away the habitat, impedes feeding, and interrupts their daily activities that they need to survive. And as we see more pollution in Stroubles Creek, you can see we would move from some of the species on the left, some which I just mentioned, caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, to on the right, more pollution tolerant species, such as flatworms, leeches, midges, rat-tailed maggots, if you've ever heard of those, and some lunged snails. And so snails with lungs tend to do better because they can breathe the air, whereas gilled snails need cleaner water. So we would see more gilled snails in a cleaner stream, more lung snails in a dirty stream, and overall an ecological shift in these aquatic communities.
So there is a long history of recognizing the impairment at Stroubles. In 1996, the identification of the macroinvertebrate diversity impairment took place, and that placed Stroubles on the 303D list. So that started the federal recognition of Stroubles. And in 2002, it was designated federally impaired by the EPA. There is a document containing all of the reasons why online. It is very extensive but interesting. But the main reason was because of sedimentation. And the main three reasons for the sedimentation are lack of riparian buffer, livestock in the stream, and urbanization and impervious surfaces. So as we continue to pave the town of Blacksburg and the greater watershed, there's a lot of stormwater runoff that comes into the creek, and everything that is on the pavement also comes into the creek.
And following this designation as impaired, they needed to develop a total maximum daily load plan, which required identifying exactly what that load was. So how much sediment can go into Stroubles Creek before it's a problem is really the question that they were asking. And so Virginia Tech, many entities at Virginia Tech partnered with the DEQ and EPA to identify what that amount was and what we needed to do to lessen the amount of sediment going into Stroubles Creek. And they identified three main best management practices, or BMPs, as we'll refer to them. Stormwater BMPs, so in the places where we've paved and built apartments and all that wonderful urban development, we need to find ways to manage that stormwater so that it's not inundating Stroubles Creek in these high water events. We also needed to exclude livestock from streams because there were still places where cattle, sheep, horses were accessing waterways, and we needed to implement riparian buffers with native plants that would work to filter the water and create a buffer before that water goes into the stream.
Right, so this is a picture of one of our tree plantings. We'll talk a little more about those. So there are three, well, I'll get into the three main types of restoration, if you want to give the brief timeline.
So as we identified earlier, there was a TMDL study completed around 2002, 2003. The plan was developed and implemented in 2006. That really was the starting point of restoration. That was where we identified concrete goals and ways to achieve them. So in 2009, biological systems engineering began working on cattle exclusion, putting up lots of fencing, and began regrading the stream bank. So if you see the top right image, there's before and after stream bank regrading. And we'll talk more about floodplain connectivity, but that's one way to get that creek to reconnect with its banks, which is a really important part of the cycle with riparian areas. And in 2009, there were also the first riparian buffer plantings. So biological systems engineering and multiple entities worked together to start planting some native species and removing invasive species so we could shift it back to a more traditional ecosystem. Then in 2014, this is kind of where our work began as the Ecological Restoration Coalition and Stroubles Creek Coalition. What's that?
Collaborative.
So there was a half-acre riparian planting, and these plantings continued. This work continued to the big plant, which officially started in 2019. So we're coming up on our 8th big plant this year. And efforts have continued since, all of these restoration efforts, such as exclusion, plantings, restoration, regrading, and all of that fun stuff.
So Ecological Restoration Collaborative, the name has changed over time. It started as Save Stroubles, and then the Stroubles Creek Coalition, and recently has changed to be the Ecological Restoration Collaborative. And what this is, because we get a lot of questions about who in the world we work for, and it's hard to answer sometimes. We work for Watershed Restoration Solutions and also for New River Conservancy. However, Ecological Restoration Collaborative is a group of many entities who work together to restore the creek. There are organizations in town, community organizations, student groups, entities at Virginia Tech, the Office of Sustainability. There are lots of different departments involved in this. And of course, we have many, many volunteers, contract crews, all kinds of people who come together to make this possible. And so since 2012, we have planted over 130,000 trees, not just us, but people who came before us also. We have planted over 63,000 of those during big plant events alone. So that has been a huge, huge help to this project. That is all volunteers. And that is why this event is so important and why we talk about it. But as you'll see, it's one of the smallest parts of this project. So usually it's what people think of, but it is one of the very small components of many. We have planted over 80 acres on a footprint that is over 150 acres, but not all of those acres should be turned back into forest. Some of them need to remain meadows, some of them are wetlands, but we have been working on that 150 acre plus footprint. And we have had many thousands of volunteers help us. In the initial efforts, 485 riparian trees and shrubs were planted through biological systems engineering at Virginia Tech. They installed 1,200 feet of exclusion fencing and 3 bioretention cells at Fox Ridge. Do you want to briefly explain those?
So there's some really great pictures online if you want to go digging, and a wonderful report on these bioretention cells. But essentially at Fox Ridge, where there were two major buildings that were displacing water and creating a lot of runoff, the biological systems engineering department got together. They dug out a large area, put some, I believe, plastic or geotextile fabric there to retain some of that water, and planted native plants over top so that that essential rain garden function, so that the native trees could start to take up the water, and it gave the water time to filter before going back into the watershed.
We have also removed invasive species on that 150 plus acre footprint. They are not all gone. They will never be all gone. This is an ongoing project, but we have addressed them on all of those acres. And fortunately, this is very exciting. There are no official publications about this that we have managed to find so far. However, the Entrican Lab of Aquatic Entomology at Tech has noted the return of some of the mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies that were historically absent from this creek. So that's really exciting news. It means that what we're doing is working, which is great. But our three main restoration focus points are floodplain connectivity, riparian buffers, and invasive species. So we'll talk about each of those and why we do those and what they provide for the ecosystem.
So as I mentioned earlier, floodplain connectivity is a big part of what we do, and it's kind of a starting point for restoring a stream. A stream ought to be connected to its banks in a healthy state in eastern ecosystems. So in our top picture, you see this cycle. This floodplain is connected whenever there's a high water event. The flood is coming out onto the banks, which we might look at that and think, oh no, it's flooding, like what's going to happen? That's bad for people. But it's actually the beginning of nutrient cycling. It allows for woody debris input. It allows for deposition of nutrients. So if you know about, like, historically that they would farm along the Nile River because it would flood and make it very fertile. So it allows for these really important ecological functions to continue. Whereas a deeply incised channel, which is what we were seeing at Stroubles Creek, there was a very vertical channel. In high water events, it's not going to be able to overflow its banks. And it's going to kind of create this hose pipe effect and maintain a high velocity without being able to slow down and absorb. So we want to work to connect those floodplains, and that's what biological systems engineering did as they regraded that stream there. Biological systems engineering does a great job, and so do these guys. We love beavers. They're some of our best ecological engineers. They do some really important things by building beaver dams. The beaver dams help connect that floodplain because it slows the water down and creates this beaver pond. And the beaver pond can help us by filling up beyond the banks of a stream that may be impaired with a deeply incised channel. And so at Streamlab, they've created 3 experimental zones. At one place, they regraded the banks, as we showed in an earlier picture. At another, they simply installed a beaver dam analog. So people got together, they suited up in waders, and they went out and put some sticks in the ground, plugged it up, and now there's essentially a beaver pond there. It was so good that there's actually evidence of beavers using that pond. And then we have a control section further down. So over the course of the last 10 or 12 years, they've been studying differences there.
It is also worth noting that beavers, because of this effect they have on helping to reestablish wetlands, have been used in California and other places out west to prevent wildfires because they create natural fire breaks. And in the 1940s, there is video evidence of this online. They parachuted beavers out of airplanes in order to reintroduce some. So if that's something you're interested in, that is out there.
Here we've got a picture of us installing yet another beaver dam analog last spring with an ecological restoration field practicum course we did. So we took some good old classic wooden stakes and pounded them into the stream bed there. And then we used some live stakes from black willow trees, which to our surprise and happiness, they sprouted and it's kind of become a living dam. So we took these cuttings from the black willow and they're growing into full-size trees at this point. But it has done a good job at backing up the stream and reconnecting some of that floodplain, as well as inundating an area that's totally overflowing with autumn olive, which is an invasive species. And hopefully over time, as it floods that area, it'll kill some of those perennial woodland areas that include a lot of invasive species.
So riparian buffers, this is a drone photo that was captured above the Virginia Tech Streamlab. I think it's a really beautiful photo. The areas directly along the creek in the middle where you can see some larger trees and shrubs, Those were planted in the early 2000s, a lot of them. And you can see maybe the tree tubes on either side. Those were a more recent planting. And so we do a lot of our work around there. But we have noticed some improvements in this area specifically, which is very exciting. Does anyone know what a riparian buffer is? Yeah, some nods? Okay. So for those who don't know, it is the area of vegetation immediately around a body of water, and it's a buffer because it is between everything else like parking lots and the actual body of water. Some essential components of it, it needs to have woody vegetation and also herbaceous vegetation. It needs to have lots of different kinds of root structures, and we'll talk about those in a minute. The width determinations differ based on how deep the creek is, how deep the stream banks are, what the angle is of the slope around it. Ideally, in this area, it would be over 300 feet wide, but we have to stick to about 35 feet. So we're doing what we can. Does anyone have any ideas of why riparian buffers might be important? Anybody? All right, we'll talk about it. So this is one of the most important. This is why they are critical to Stroubles Creek. They stabilize stream banks with their roots, and so then they help prevent erosion and the incised stream banks that we've been talking about. They absorb flood shock, so the water, if there is floodplain connectivity, will flow out into the trees and the soil will be more permeable. And so it will absorb a lot of the water and slow it down so that we don't have like a horrible fast moving flood. They also filter pollutants physically by catching trash, but also a lot of plants are able to uptake some pollutants that otherwise just linger in the water. They lower the water temperature, which is great for all of our native fish and insects. Stroubles Creek is way too warm, so that's part of the reason that we don't have many native species left. They deposit woody debris, which we'll talk about, and organic sediment. So not all sediment is bad. They create stream meanders. You don't want just a straight stream bank because that's going to emphasize the hose pipe effect. You want it to move around a little bit. And they provide food and habitat for people and for animals, microhabitats, which we'll talk about. And they create wildlife corridors, which are especially important here where we have so much urban development.
So here we've got a good image of what happens in an area that needs riparian buffers and gets a lot of rain. So we've got Virginia Tech agricultural lands. They do a lot of great work with horses. The horses are very happy, but the problem is the horses are intensively grazing and they're compacting the soil with their large, beautiful bodies. They walk over the soil and make it less absorbent and less permeable. So there's a lack of plant roots there to stabilize the soil. As you can see, we've got this great field, intensive agriculture and the soil compaction. So when that water hits it, it just kind of runs off. Where if it fell up in the Jefferson National Forest, it would take time to soak in. And then we end up with downstream erosion, runoff, high sediment load from some of the sediment and topsoil that's washing away, and higher waters during flood events because we don't allow the time for that water to soak in.
This is actually, is anyone familiar with the road between Smithfield Plantation and the ag fields? It's horrible. You can't get a small car back there easily. The potholes are like feet deep, and this is part of the reason why. That's a picture of that road during a flood event, I believe 2 years ago during a February flood.
So riparian buffers play an important role by absorbing flood shock and filtering pollutants. As you may know, and as we've talked about a little bit, you can see on the left, roots stabilize the soil and absorb nutrients. So things like horse manure, cow manure, livestock runoff, livestock products, they have time to sit in that soil. And trees like a little bit of fertilizer, but it's not something that we want to swim in downstream, especially on a hot day. So on the right side, you can see some of our tall native grasses. They also work to filter pollutants and take all of that water up in a faster way. They prevent erosion with their deep roots. Native species tend to do a better job by having a deeper root system, and these perennial buffers help maintain ditches by preventing that erosion. You can see this stream here has a more ideal shape. It's allowed to expand as it flows upward, as it fills. And let's talk a little bit about woody debris and organic sediment. So we just talked about why some sediments are bad, like when all the soil's washing away and when the banks are washing out. But organic sediment plays a really important role in not only the headwaters ecosystem, but the river ecosystem and deep sea marine environments. So here we've got a stonefly. I love stoneflies. I think they're very beautiful little creatures, and they tend to be sort of rare in our urban streams like Stroubles because they're pollution intolerant. And they really like living on the undersides of wood. And so when we take away the trees along the edge of the stream, there's not as much wood for these guys to live on. They like the wood because as the wood breaks down, it supports the growth of different algae, different microbiota, and they scrape that off and use that to begin the food chain there. On the right, we've got one of our special orders from some work in Blacksburg. We had some arborists who, when they did work on large trees, they would bring the boles or the trunks to us, and we'll be using that to fill in the stream at Stroubles to create somewhat of a beaver dam effect, but also that woody debris input so that stoneflies, mayflies, caddisflies alike can enjoy woody debris for years to come as it breaks down into organic sediment to support the algae, and ultimately ends up in the deep sea beyond the Mississippi River Delta. So when we remove that woody input, it can actually cause deep sea marine environments to collapse.
We took this picture as a joke, actually, because we were stuck behind it on the way to work. And our boss had said that he was sending someone with some woody debris like 2 months before. And we said, oh, look, your friend is making us late. And it turned out it was because he had forgotten to tell him to stop coming. So we have many, many tons of woody debris that we need to deal with.
Another thing we like to focus on as we reforest the riparian buffers is food and habitat for not only wildlife, but for humans. So when we give to the land, it gives back. After a prescribed burn and some regrowth this spring, we found this beautiful black rat snake greeting us in some of the vegetation that was there for the first time in many years. In the middle, we've got a picture of a Miyawaki plot, which is a method of planting. It's a Japanese urban forestry method that involves planting super densely. So like 1 foot spacing, where in a lot of reforestation plantings, you might see 10 or 12 foot spacing. This is super close, and it allows the environment to simulate secondary succession as trees would grow back and compete with one another. It happens really quickly because they're so close to one another. It also aids in seed dispersal. So when we have, maybe 37 different species all packed into a couple meters, the birds come and they love that, and they spread the seeds around to surrounding areas. And insects really like it. As you can see on the right, we had many monarchs this year, beautiful monarch caterpillars popping up on milkweed and ironweeds and different species that were allowed to pop up after some regrowth.
There is a study going on at Tech at the moment with the Ecological Restoration Lab about these Miyawaki plots and how they can be used for seed dispersal, especially on massive planting footprints, like tens of thousands of acres, so that we're not trying to plant the entire thing, but maybe just little pockets and hoping that they will reseed themselves.
So as we think about what the land can provide back for us, we want to make sure that we plant species that are beneficial to humans and wildlife alike. So does anybody recognize the little berry cluster in the top left? I hear it, elderberry, very nice. So that's elderberry. A lot of people like to collect that for different medicinal value, different syrups and such. We've got some American chestnut. Below that is a hazelnut. Top right, we've got white oak. I don't know if anybody's ever had some acorn pancakes, but white oak acorns make excellent pancakes. We've got the pawpaw, the famous fall fruit, and American persimmon are just a few that I wanted to highlight because they are classically used in recipes and foraging and in Appalachian cooking methods. So the more appeal we have to the public by putting these species out along Stroubles Creek, the more support that we'll have in the long term in case we face development or we face a highway or we face expanding apartments and that sort of thing.
Which we are facing. The 460 connector project goes right through one of our restoration areas. So one of our hopes is that by getting community involved and making this something that is directly beneficial to people, that maybe that will help the forests that we are trying to plant not get cut down when that happens.
Another thing we like to think about is habitat and microhabitat. So when you plant a tree, you're not just adding some three-dimensional habitat, but you're changing the habitat from a meadow or a field into forest. And so you can see here the American goldfinch perching on our tube is really enjoying that open space, that shrubland meadow type of habitat, which will change over time. And I'll talk about that in a second. On the right, we've got a large black willow that fell over last spring after some high winds, and it pulled up the bank with it, which it's sad to see a black willow go, but it's also the beginning of a new habitat. there will be species that really enjoy where that bank has pulled up, and they'll nestle up in there for shelter and cover. It's also a shady area for the creek to cool down a little bit before it continues going downstream. And microhabitats change as a tree grows, which is something that's near and dear to my heart, big old gnarled trees like this. So does anybody have an idea of how the tree on the right might provide some microhabitat for maybe mammals or insects, or any ideas? Your woodpeckers? Yep, insects would love being here. Very nice. So here are just a few that we focus on. As the tree grows, it's obviously perch and nesting location for birds like woodpeckers, who love it once the wood gets a little soft and they can gnarl in there and make a nest. They also eat insects that enjoy getting into that decaying wood. Dendrotelms, which is a fun word. It's an area in a tree that tends to hold water, and birds use that for drinking water, for baths. Salamanders will get in them, insects will get in them. Bats also use the deep furrowed bark on trees. Like white oaks have this big scaly platy bark, but only as they're older. And we have some rare species of bats in Virginia that will shelter up under those bark plates. Also the classic possum or raccoon up in the hollow of a tree, bears in the wintertime, and mosses and lichens form all over the tree. And then we get the mycorrhizal network, or the fungal network in the soils, that develop and get more and more rich as the forest ages. And then back to the habitats and microhabitats. The American goldfinch will watch as its meadow habitat turns into forest, and that'll change and attract different species. And perhaps the goldfinch will still use it, but probably stay on the edges. And as our trees mature, they can pull up more banks and create really a diversity of habitat, which is what we want in the long term.
So we get asked a lot how many species we plant, what kinds we plant, why we choose the ones we do. So it's really important to have a lot of biodiversity. Part of the reason is because of things like pathogens and pests. We have unfortunately noticed spotted lanternflies at Stroubles Creek now. I think there were about 5 last year. So they're here. And things like that, it's really important to have more than 1 or 2 or 5 types of trees, because if one tree falls prey to a pathogen or a pest, then we lose the entire system. But we tend to plant 30 to 40 different kinds of trees each year in each area. And so by doing that, we're hoping that something will hold on, even if everything else falls apart. And we choose our species based on the different areas we're planting in. Some like high pH, some like low pH, some like a lot of water or no water, a lot of sun, no sun. And so we try to choose species that do well in each area, and also ones like Sydney was talking about that will provide food, especially for people and for animals. Our planting layouts differ also depending on what we're going for. We plant in rows sometimes, and I'll talk a bit about why that's useful. And we also have our Milwaukee plots. We tend to have to fence those because of deer, and so those are a bit more intensive, but we do our best. And so again, our main restoration areas are the places you see in red. It's mostly on Virginia Tech and Virginia Tech Foundation land, especially down in the Stroubles main stem and docks branch. The Sheep and Beef Center is another place we focus on, and Smithfield Plantation is another one. So this is one of our special target areas. We are trying to incorporate now some agroforestry and silvopasture. Silvopasture is a type of agroforestry, and it involves integrating trees and other plants, especially native plants, into pasture lands and croplands for mutual benefit. So it helps the creek by stabilizing the banks and everything that we've talked about, but also provides shade and food for all of the species there, like the sheep and the cattle. So we have to choose species that aren't poisonous to them and that they can benefit from. With the fence out laws, there are still some areas that don't have to be fenced out. So it is really important that we include some riparian areas there and plant a lot of trees to do what the fencing cannot. And of course, it's important for sheep and cattle to have access to water. And so there are some areas where it will continue to be that they will access the stream, but there are some methods that people use, like having really narrow fencing. It will narrow to a point so that only one animal can access it at a time, and there isn't a big sheep party happening in the stream. I've seen some sheep parties.
So speaking of sheep parties, this is one of our focus areas up at Holton Branch behind the Copenhagen Sheep Center, where we have focused on adding livestock-friendly tree species, not only for the nutrition of the sheep, but for future shade and protection of animals. And there's a small perennial wetland in there that will benefit from having not only shade to cool it down, but also some stabilization on the banks there. And we had some serious erosion happening. Next slide. And there was some serious erosion happening slightly from upstream development and some paved areas upstream, but largely because it's not forested. It has a steep grade there, and the sheep are constantly doing their thing, just eating and moving around. So as we forest this, it'll help keep some of the sheep manure in its place for a while it fertilizes the trees and keep it from running off directly into Stroubles Creek, becoming a hot manure mess, which is really not what we want as the face of Black Spruce watershed.
And this is another special target area. We're working with Smithfield Plantation. We've been working with them for a couple of years, but we are going to have a planting event there this year. It's going to be part of the big plant. And so the goals of this area have a couple different parts to them. Smithfield is adjacent to one of our buffer areas we've already planted, and so we're trying to make it as wide as we can, but we're also helping them take out invasive species so that those invasive species on their land don't spread to the places we've already treated. And so it's beneficial for everybody. Some things that you might see happening, because we get a lot of questions, this very visible area. We have mapped out the areas that we'll be planting and treating, which involves not putting herbicides in the wetlands, making sure that we're not digging up any kind of archaeological site. And so we're working with their people on that. We are removing invasive species, which involves herbicides, but also mulching, and that tends to look pretty destructive. We get a lot of questions about that because we have a mulcher come in and turn all of the invasives into wood chips. And if you don't know that it's only invasives, it looks like we're just tearing down the entire forest, and it looks awful, but it should help. And we'll be planting trees there specifically for overstory recruitment, because we have a lot of overstory trees there already, but the shade from the invasive species in the understory is preventing any seedlings from growing. So we don't have any future overstory trees there right now. And so if something happens to the current older trees, we will lose our forest. And then we'll be going in and out to do maintenance on our tree tubes and on the invasives. We're working with them to figure out our species list, because they do have a record of the species that were there when the plantation was established. There are still some of them there. There's a mature American elm, which is really beautiful, and some little elm seedlings, which I haven't seen anywhere. It's really exciting. And they have an Osage orange, and those were typically used to mark property boundaries. So that's a neat little historical presence there. But we will be trying to plant species that would historically have been in this ecosystem and that will help it regenerate. And invasive species, I bet some of you in here have encountered these before. These are not all of the ones that we deal with, but it's a pretty good list. So we deal with all of those species, plus some others, as we were trying to do our work. They have occupied this place in the ecosystem for several reasons. One is because when there is intensive agriculture, often forests are clear cut, and then we have animals in eating plants, trampling plants. But when they are fenced out or removed for any other reason, then there is a blank slate. And what tends to come back really quickly is invasives, and seed dispersal is very easy in those blank slate areas. And so immediately what we get, rather than the regeneration of a native forest, which would happen very slowly, is we get 20-foot tall autumn olive and privet so thick you can't walk through it, which is not exactly what we're going for. It's important to remove them so that we have room for the native species, but also because they don't serve any ecological benefit that we know of yet anyway. They don't tend to be eaten by native species, and they have not evolved with this ecosystem, so they are not an essential component of it. We have a lot of removal methods that we use. It's integrated species management, which is a combination of many different methods. We try to use prescribed fire when possible. not always possible because we're near a university and apartment buildings and a highway, lots of things that don't want smoke. We use herbicides carefully and selectively. We don't like to use them, but when you have 150 acres of privet, that is sometimes the only way to manage it. So we select them for the ones that are safest for the watershed, and we try to apply them only in times when they're not going to disturb any native plants or other species. We mow, and so we have organized most of our plantings into rows that we can fit mowers through because we have a lot of tall fescue. It was introduced as grass for cattle, and they do eat it, but nothing else does. So once the cattle are gone, it becomes about this tall in the summer and shades out our seedlings. We do mulching, as I said. Sometimes we use good old loppers and chainsaws. And do you want to mention the weevils?
We recently discovered an interesting integrated species management method, which is utilizing weevils as biological control against knapweed, which is one of the herbaceous species we showed in an earlier slide. It's got this beautiful purple flower, so people think, oh, pretty, and it's beautiful until it's taken over our entire planting, which it has. And so with certain species of knapweed, you can actually utilize these weevils that you order from these very nice people in Minnesota, and the weevils will bore into the seed head of the knapweed or into the roots, effectively killing the plant and preventing its seed from spreading.
Yep. So we're hoping to use that. We're working on that right now. That might be something we manage in the next year or so.
Who likes fire? See some hands?
Good.
I like fire. We like fire because it's a cost-effective and ecologically friendly method of dealing with species that don't belong here. So here's our riparian buffer burn that we did last March. And here is the patchwork of native species that we got to enjoy over the summer. And what we did in that area was we initially sprayed the fescue field with herbicide to knock it back, and then burned the field to get rid of what was remaining. And we waited, and we got to see this beautiful patchwork of dogbane and milkweed and goldenrod and a variety of different sedges and really cool species that we did not expect, but who were greatly enjoyed by butterflies and insects, snakes, all alike.
And it's important to use fire here. There's a really cool book called, I think it's Fire in Blue Ridge Ecozones. It's a really extensive document, but fire is a part of the historic ecosystem around here. And the exclusion of fire, which started in the early 1900s, is part of the reason that we have seen mesification of eastern forests, meaning they have become wetter. And so areas that typically were not that wet have become wet now. And so we are seeing a change in the tree species and the other perennial vegetation species that grow there, and including things like red maple, which is considered kind of a junk tree. It's the most numerous tree in Virginia by stem count, and they are not fire adapted. And the exclusion of fire has led them to repopulate all these areas that they were not traditionally seen. And so using fire is a really important way to get our ecosystem back.
Now, if you've ever tried to plant a vegetable or grow a vegetable in Southwest Virginia, you may have found yourself saying, those dang deer. And we find ourselves saying those dang deer just about every day we're working out at Stroubles. And so we'll talk a little bit about the complications of an unmanaged native species and how that contributes to not only some destruction of the work that we do, but also a shift in the ecosystem. So these deer are impressive and they're beautiful and they're terribly abundant out at Stroubles Creek because they thrive in these edge habitats in suburban ecosystems. There are actually more white-tailed deer in the United States now than there were in the past 500 years in any historic record, really, because of a lack of hunting and development, including suburban areas. So as these deer become bold and abundant, they scrape up our trees like this bald cypress on the left. We've had some mature trees be completely girdled and killed because the deer like to scrape them up. We go out to find our tree shelters 5 feet up in the air.
That's not what they're supposed to look like.
They're supposed to be on the ground. They're not supposed to be up above my head. And it prevents the tree from being protected in the way that it should be against herbivory from like voles and rodents. And then the deer are just super excited to eat a fresh native sprout coming out of the top of the tube. Sometimes we call them deer lollipops because the deer come back year after year, and it really alters the form of our native trees. It doesn't allow them to grow tall and straight like they would in a natural forest setting. They end up branching out. And some of these trees, like the one on the right, are as old as 6 or 7 years, but they're not able to surpass 5 feet.
Yeah, we have trees in more protected areas that are the same age that at this point have reached about 10 feet tall. So this is a huge issue.
So that's inconvenient to our project specifically, but some of the greater implications of an unmanaged deer population include highway collisions. I'm sure you've seen highway collisions if you drive down 460 or Price's Fork Road. There are lots of deer who get hit, lots of insurance claims. And we end up with an ecosystem change that favors invasive species. Because white-tailed deer evolved alongside our native species, that's what they're going to eat. And when they're in numbers of 50, 60 plus, they're going to heavily prey on the native species. So what's left is privet and autumn olive and Japanese barberry and things that the deer say, I have no use for that. And they abound and they reseed, and we end up with this understory below, big, tall, beautiful oaks, but it's totally thick with invasive species, and the oaks aren't able to regenerate naturally. We also have to consider the long-term health of the herds. There's a lot of wildlife disease in the news, and it's getting closer to Blacksburg with chronic wasting disease being a primary concern, a number of other diseases that affect deer. They spread ticks, which spread Lyme disease. So managing this deer population is a priority of ours, and we're working with Virginia Tech and other agencies to hopefully get something figured out.
So some of our things that we are doing right now and will be doing in the near future, the big plant is happening again this year. It is March 28th and 29th in Blacksburg. There's one the previous weekend in Radford that will be Friday through Sunday. And this year, the big plant in Blacksburg will take place at Smithfield and then also at Heritage Park. So not part of this project specifically, but Tom's Creek Watershed is another watershed we're working on. We also have the Ecological Restoration Field Practicum at Virginia Tech, which is a 1-week class that we teach during spring break for ecological restoration students. And they get hands-on experience. They have a lot of fun. They get to get out of the classroom and out from behind a laptop and come chainsaw and plant trees and help us get a lot of work done while they're learning about practical applications of what they're learning. And we've had AmeriCorps and CCC teams come and help us. I'll talk about those in a moment. And we also have plenty of volunteer opportunities. It depends on the season, so I'll talk about that in a moment too, but we have stream cleanups going on, big river cleanups, planting events, work throughout the year, and our Stroubles Creek Stewards certificate, which Sydney will talk about. AmeriCorps and CCC is AmeriCorps National Civilian Community Corps. We've had 3 teams. The third is arriving in 2 or 3 weeks, which is very exciting. It's a federal volunteer program for young adults. They're usually 18 to 26 years old, and they stay in a team for a whole year, travel all around the country, get an education award and no money to do projects all around in different communities, help with food pantries and tutoring and taxes, but they have come and helped us. They have helped us run the big plant several times. They are going to do that again this year, which is wonderful. And they help us do all of the maintenance and monitoring that we don't have grant funding for. So all of these projects are grant funded. We get grant funding through a huge variety of entities, but mostly those grants cover the acquisition of and planting of trees, and they don't cover the maintenance efforts that are really essential to their survival. So we rely entirely on volunteers for that. And for counting things like how many dead trees do we have this year and how many do we need to replace? And 130,000 is a lot to count, just the 2 of us. So we like having help. So our volunteer opportunities depend on the season. We don't do a whole lot in the midsummer because it's too hot and there's not much going on. We have different project priorities that evolve periodically. The weather gets in the way, as it has lately, and we just have all kinds of other needs that pop up. But we have a wide variety of tasks. We have mortality monitoring, and this is better for people who can keep coming back because learning how to tell if a tree is alive or dead in the winter is actually not very easy. And we have things like autumn olive come up in the tree tubes and look like a nice living tree, and it's not the tree we want. So that's good for people who we can really make sure that they're solid on making sure the tree is alive. We have many maintenance tasks. We install bird nets to keep birds from falling in the tubes and dying. We pull plastic tubes out once their life is over. We install new stakes as they also fall apart. There's all kinds of things that we do out there. We need field leaders for the big plant and people who just want to come plant and not do any leading, and just various other tasks as they come up.
So something we were excited to kick off at the end of last year was our Stroubles Creek Stewards program, which is a certificate awarded for 10 hours or more of volunteer service with us. In any work one would do with us, they're going to learn about native plant identification, invasive plant identification, restoration techniques, what it's like to be in a riparian ecosystem, and the essentials of field work. And we wanted to kick this off because, first of all, who doesn't love a good certificate? And second of all, lowering the barrier to entry for this type of work is something that's really important to us. There are so many people who want to get into conservation work, but they don't have that field experience, or they don't have that bullet point on their resume. So anything we can do to get people interested in this work is points for our planet, points for our communities.
And these are some things you can do on your own time. You can pick up trash you see. It all gets swept into Stroubles Creek eventually. This group of cadets pulled out more than 600 pounds recently. And before that, about 6 months before, the same thing happened. So it just keeps on piling up. Fixing oil leaks in vehicles is really important because oil that gets on the road also goes into the creek. You can join a cleanup event that we host, advocate for water quality protection, participate in salt watch testing. The Isaac Walton League will send you a free kit and you can test water as the snow is melting and taking runoff from the roads. And use sustainable practices. Watch your herbicide use. Be careful not to use herbicide in your water. Try not to use it unless necessary. Use it correctly. Try not to use too much water, though that there's only so much we can do as individuals, but still good to do. And you can volunteer with us.
And just some big picture lessons learned with all the work that we've been doing. Adapt and overcome, like in anything. We've had to make many adjustments. We've learned lessons over 10 years of doing projects of what works well in this area, what works well in the soils, what works well with the weather, and how can we learn from that and move forward. And we've really refined and developed our techniques so that we can have successful plantings from the get-go and just focus on maintenance in the years after. We've learned from the ecosystem as we watch trees connect to one another and communicate. Nothing stands alone in the ecosystem. And just like our ecological restoration collaborative, none of us stand alone. We all work together, and there's no way this work would happen without the numerous partnerships that we have and the tendrils that go off into the community. We're also restoring the environment to a new normal. So we are working with invasive species. We're working with development. Our forests and our riparian buffers are never going to look like what they did in pre-colonial times. So we're learning as we go how to restore to a functioning ecosystem that looks just a little bit different than it may have in the past, rather than expend all of our energy trying to get it back to how it may never be. And volunteers are essential for everything that we do. So we always give a hand and a big thanks to them.
Any questions? Yes.
Can you repeat the question? Yeah. People on the Zoom.
Yes.
And we started a little late, so it's okay. Maybe go a few minutes.
Yeah.
You said that, first of all, it's a wonderful presentation. Thank you. But why is Stroubles Creek considered too warm?
Okay, so the question is, why is Stroubles Creek considered too warm? Part of the reason is the lack of shade cast on it, but also it has become a lot shallower in recent years. Part of the reason is because of the change in the stream bank grading, and also because it now moves. You're better at explaining this than I am.
So the sedimentation can certainly fill in what used to be like a deep pool where the water would sit and be cool for a while. And the stream banks erode more quickly. So we're missing that diversity of habitat that would provide shade to the ecosystem, and as well as battling runoff from hot black pavement in the summertime.
Any others?
Did you say something about the 460, some project there?
Yes. Do you want to explain the 460 project?
Yeah. So there's a question about the 460 connector project. The project was proposing a connector between 460 and somewhere out towards Radford, I believe. Someone in here may know better than I do, but it was going to be a pretty well-traveled highway that would go right across some of the farmlands and some of the restoration areas that we're working on, particularly on the south side.
Yeah, I believe there's more information online, but there is an old growth oak forest up above the lower area of where we're doing our restoration, kind of off the south gate exit. And it would probably go straight through that forest behind the Merrimack neighborhood. Someone there?
So started in 2006, kind of with the restoration plan. Do you have an idea of how long the project is going to take? And is it just going to be focused in that area, or is there any plans for moving upstream?
Okay, the question is, how long will the project take and on expansion? So it really depends. We are running out of areas to plant, which is very exciting. We've used up a lot of our planting footprint. So eventually we will plan to not create any new planting footprints, but we do want eventually 100% survival of the trees we have planted. And so some of our grant funding, we just got an extension for another 2 years of maintenance. We got one maintenance grant, so that's very exciting. So probably in 2027, things will start tapering off. And that's why volunteers are so important to us, because if we get people involved, then once the money goes away and we can't keep officially working there, we can still have people out there working on it. It does mean there's a bit of a rush to get the invasive species under control quickly so that they're not taking back over immediately as soon as we have to leave. But we are hoping to expand to the duck pond eventually. We've talked with Virginia Tech about that, and they want to plant around the duck pond, which we're very surprised about. We're very excited. And hopefully there are a couple more areas we could work in, but beyond the Virginia Tech Streamlabs, Stroubles is on private land all the way down to the Radford Arsenal. So after we have filled up this footprint, we have kind of run out of space.
Are there any opportunities for those private landowners to benefit from information, like for removing, I live downstream, for removing invasive species and such further down? Or is there any help with that?
There are some programs that help private landowners with restoration. Some of them come through the Department of Forestry, and it's called the RIFL project, Riparian Forests for Landowners. And that does not allow money for invasive species removal, but it does allow for money for riparian plantings. And I think they require under 20% invasive coverage. I'm not aware at the moment of any programs for reducing invasive species on private land, but there might be grant match programs where if you put in a certain amount of work or money for reducing them, you might be given more money for planting projects.
It is also Invasive Species Awareness Week. So if you want to look around, there are lots of good resources circulating right now.
Oh, and the Virginia Native Plant Society might be able to help with that also. Yeah, there's.
We have the legislature and governor now Democratic, and we have a new state rep from this area, Franklin, Lily Franklin. Yeah. So is there anything on the state level that would help the project, or that is already going on with the project?
It's a good question. The question is if there's anything on the state level with the government that could help with the project. Something that would help. There are always advocacy opportunities with new bills being proposed. There was one recently, and I actually haven't kept up with it, that is pushing for in plant nurseries for there to be signage required signage saying that plants are invasive, because unfortunately people don't know and will plant them regardless. And there are also different water quality bills being introduced all the time, but do you know of any specifically?
There are a number of bills, yeah, I think banning the sale of invasive species in Virginia. So if that could be passed, it would certainly help landowners from planting more. But yeah, other than that, there are a lot of new things coming. I've seen some things about wildlife corridors as well, which would definitely be interesting because some of the work we do relates to wildlife corridors.
There's actually a comment period open right now, and I forget the bill number, but on wildlife corridors is being proposed, I think, this week.
There's a couple questions in the chat.
Yes.
How do I find out about volunteering opportunities in the state?
We have just launched a new website, the Ecological Restoration Collaborative.org. Perhaps we could link that afterwards or something. And we've got information on there about what we do. There's a link to volunteer. We've got a sheet that you fill out and we'll contact with any volunteer opportunities that come up.
Okay, we can put that in our emails and put links on our website.
Okay,
See.
great.
Another one is, how will the Harding Avenue stormwater project impact the creek and watershed?
That is a good question. I'm not too familiar with the Harding Avenue stormwater project.
It says, how will the Harding Avenue stormwater project impact the creek and watershed?
That's probably a question for the stormwater engineer. Tell that person online they could reach out to Bobby Howard, the town stormwater engineer.
Interesting.
Cindy, what was the name of that website you just said?
Ecological Restoration Collaborative.org. It's a long one.
The signups for the big plant are on there or no?
Yeah. We also have Facebook and Instagram that will sometimes advertise volunteer opportunities too.
I don't have either of those things, so she deals with the social media side. Also for river cleanups that are related to Stroubles Creek or just the greater New River watershed, the New River Conservancy is where you would go to find out the dates for those. We're hoping to have one in April, a big one on the river. But we also do smaller local ones on Stroubles Creek. Okay.
And the open planting that's happening at Brown Farm. Tons of trees. So is that your work or is that the town's work or what?
Where is that?
Heritage Park.
Oh,
okay.
Heritage Park. Yes, the Heritage Park planting projects are us as well. It's not related to the Stroubles projects, but we are also the New River Conservancy and Watershed Restoration Solutions are working on those at the moment. We'll be out there this afternoon, actually.
Yeah.
So besides the one thing you talked about, the EPTs, right? Returning. Has there been any other monitoring of stream quality since then that you've seen changes in or flooding kinds of things?
Yes, so the question is about monitoring of the water quality and flooding. So the Virginia Tech Streamlab website has a lot of that information. Their test bridges have a lot of monitoring equipment on them. There's also, what was the last talk group? There's a student group that does monitoring.
The stream keepers.
Okay, yes, the Virginia Tech Stream Keepers also do water quality monitoring in the upper section closer to the duck pond. And so I believe they have a website. I'm not certain.
They actually talked about it at the previous one of these programs. We had a recording on our website.
But yeah, I would say the Streamlab website would have most of the information. There's also a list on there of all the research projects that have been conducted on Stroubles Creek, and there are a lot of really fascinating ones: water quality, beavers and birds, all kinds of things. Yes.
Heard the newspaper Cardinal News.
Yes.
So they have, I get their email every day, and they have a new reporter just for Montgomery County, the River Valley area, and she was putting out a request about articles recently, and they do a lot of notifications. Terrific about stuff. So if you haven't reached out to Cardinal News, I bet they'd be really interested in what you're doing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, definitely will.
Yeah.
Any others?
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. And we can include our contact information in a follow-up. So if you have any further questions or want to reach out about anything, please do.
I'm Brenda Van Gelder. I'm a member of the Sustainable Blacksburg Board. On behalf of the board, we'd like to thank you for giving us presentation.
Oh,
We
thank
have
you.
some Sustainable bags for
Oh,
you.
thanks so much.
Yeah.
Those were actually upside down.
Really?
Those were
Oh,
for
great.
comfort that
Yeah.
we figured out how to.
Oh, that's so cool. That's
Thank
great.
you, Jen.
Thanks. Thank you for having us.
It's a good shot.
I'm gonna
Yeah. Well,
mute us.
attending.
Thank you.